Over 30 years ago, in a country that has been long since disbanded, a disaster that the world has never seen before occurred. On April 26 in 1986 in Pripyat, Ukraine, a nuclear meltdown occurred. Due to a flawed reactor design and negligence among the workers, the fourth reactor exploded, killing 2 people and spewing radiation into the environment. 28 people slowly died following, including firefighters who risked their life to contain the meltdown and stop it from spreading to other reactors. Over 30 years after this disaster, when I hear people talk about Chernobyl, it is usually used as an attempt to show the failures of the Soviet Union and the communist government. When I think about Chernobyl, I think of a much different reality. I remember the stories my parents told me about being evacuated as kids after the disaster. When I think about Chernobyl, I worry about my family who lived within the fallout. I worry about me, my parents, and everyone else whose lives have been impacted by radiation. I worry about all the health issues that can be caused by radiation exposure, and I worry about my family developing cancer. It is easy to not fully understand the disaster. The disaster didn't just occur at the reactor. According to a paper published in the U.S. National Library of Health and Medicine, Institute of Health, nearly 400 million people resided in areas that were contaminated with radioactivity. The radiation impacted more than just the surrounding area, but areas close to the meltdown are still plagued by issues that come from high levels of radiation. In this speech, I hope to first inform you how far the radiation has spread, then explains the effect it has had on human life and the impacts it currently has and is continuing to have on our environment. First, I'm going to talk about how far the radiation has spread. Although the government worked to control the initial meltdown, reactors fires burned for another 10 days, spewing radiation into the air. According to the World Nuclear Health Organization, not only did dangerous gases from Chernobyl escape, but at least 5% of Chernobyl's 200 tons of nuclear material escaped. This help shows that it wasn't just radioactive material that spread, but also dangerous gases that impacted others. This material traveled across the world. According to an article from the World Health Organization, the release of radioactive material lasted for 10 days and contaminated more than 200,000 square kilometers of Europe. This helps to show that even though the meltdown was contained, the fires on top of the reactors continued to spew radiation, and it did cover a large percent of Europe. Something that I learned and is important to know from a New York Times article on Chernobyl is that these particles have an average half-life of 30 years, meaning that if there was 2 particles, after 30 years there'd be 1. So even though 30 years have passed, large areas are still contaminated. According to Nobel Prize-winning author Svetlana Alexievich in Voices from Chernobyl, 27% of Belarus, 5% of Ukraine, and 0.5% of Russia are still contaminated. This equates to 18 million hectaacres, or roughly the size of Oklahoma. And now I know that may not seem like a lot, but you have to understand that this is mostly concentrated in three countries. And another thing that the book states is that 1 in 5 Belarusians live on contaminated land. If you don't know what Belarus is, that's okay. It's a widely unknown country, but it has a population of 10 million. So in Belarus alone, not including Ukraine or Russia, 2 million people live on contaminated land. This disaster initially spread across the world, but even now millions of people are still impacted. Next, I will talk about health issues that were caused by Chernobyl. Years after the disaster, we learned about the health issues radiation has on humans. An article from the World Health Organization states, residents who ate food contaminated with radioactive iodine received high doses of radiation to their thyroids. I found this particularly sad because my parents told me stories about how people would go and forage food and they wouldn't get it tested because they were worried the government would destroy it and they would go hungry. So they would eat food which was potentially radioactive, and as we will see, this caused future issues down the line. According to an article from All Things Nuclear about Chernobyl and cancer, between 27,000 and 108,000 cases of cancer and between 12,000 and 57,000 cancer deaths will occur from Chernobyl. Going back to what I just said, people would eat food that is radioactive, it impact their thyroid, and then further down the line, people would develop thyroid cancers. Sadly though, children who are exposed face much more serious issues. In a Reuters articles about Chernobyl and birth defects, it states, rate of birth defects in contaminated areas are twice as high as non-contaminated areas. I suggest you take this time right now to Google the kids of Chernobyl. The images are very difficult, but it paints a brutally honest picture about the horrors of radiation and the impacts it's had on people. But if that wasn't sad enough, a paper in the National Library of Medicine found in a survey of 1,080 children who were affected, up to 30% experienced thyroid issues or cancer. Kids closest to the meltdown experienced more issues, but all of them experienced more issues than just one, and including 20% have chronic tonsillitis. Radiation is an ugly killer, but sadly hundreds of thousands were affected by it and continue to be affected from the issues it's caused, like cancer, birth defects, and thyroid issues. Finally, I'll talk about Chernobyl and the effects it's had on the environment. Chernobyl has and still continues to affect the environments. Due to a lot of the radiation settling on forests, we have seen negative impacts. For example, in an article from the World Health Organization, they found increased fatality rates among plants and animals. We've learned that radiation is very deadly to humans, but it is so to animals and plants, and it also causes defects among them. In an article by the BBC about Chernobyl's biodiversity states, more evidence shows that radiation has had a significant impact and reduces biodiversity. Again, this is just cementing the fact that radiation is deadly, and whether it's humans or the environment, it has a negative impact. And if all this wasn't bad enough, radiation is still being spread. Much of the radiation fell on forests, and from the book Voices from Chernobyl, it states that 26% of Belarus's forests are contaminated. But currently, in an article from the New York Times, it states that these forests are on fire, producing radioactive smoke. So the trees absorb the radiation and it's settled there, and now that everything's on fire, radiation's in the smoke and it's continuing to spread again. Even now, 30 years later, we still have to worry about Chernobyl's impacts on the environment and its impacts of radiation still spreading. For many Americans, Chernobyl is a disaster that resulted from the failures in the Soviet Union. But to many Slavic families, the disaster is something much more. It is something that forever changed their lives and their health. From the immense scope of the area impacted to many lives that have forever been changed, we have learned that even though this disaster is 30 years old, it is still impacting millions. I hope from this presentation you can see that Chernobyl is a disaster that has affected millions and isn't just a critique of the Soviet Union.